Good morning. Thank you. My name is Ryan Paul, and I teach history here at SUU. And I'm the director of Eccles A.P.E.X. And on behalf of myself and the Eccles A.P.E.X. team, Kason Graff, Lauren Bird, and Kate Scherer, I want to welcome you all to The Shadow and the Light, Hope for Our Most Difficult Problem. I'd like to thank the Eccles Foundation for their generous and continuous support of this series, Dr. Matthew Eddy from the Department of History, Sociology, and Anthropology, Dr. Jean Bereen of the College of Humanities and Social Sciences, and the Provost's Office for making this event possible. I would like to remind you that today's conversation will continue this afternoon at 3 p.m. on Thunder 91.1 and on the A.P.E.X. Radio Hour podcast. Ward Hayes Wilson is one of the most original minds working on nuclear weapons policy today. His first scholarly article was published in Harvard's International Security. His next article won the 2008 McElvaney Prize for the best essay on nuclear disarmament. His work has shaken the foundations of the nuclear weapons debate. He has showed that atomic bombs did not force Japan to surrender, and challenged both the origins and the efficacy of nuclear deterrence. Using fundamental challenges to establish nuclear weapons thinking, he has created an entirely new approach to eliminating nuclear weapons. He has spoken in 23 countries at the Pentagon, the State Department, Harvard, Yale, Stanford, Princeton, Georgetown, the Naval War College, the Sorbonne, King's College in London, Nagasaki University, and many others. Incidentally, he just told me today that the Great Hall is the second most impressive room he's ever spoken in, only eclipsed by the General Assembly room in the United Nations building in Geneva. So there you go. He bested Sir Lawrence Friedman in a Chatham House debate and turned a pre-debate majority in favor of nuclear weapons at the Cambridge Union into a 3-1 drubbing against. His writing reaches across ideological boundaries. It has appeared in anti-nuclear journals like the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists and Non-Proliferation Review, military journals like Parameters, Joint Force Quarterly, and Revue des Défense Nationale, foreign policy journals like Survival and Foreign Policy, as well as in news media like the Chicago Tribune, the New York Times, the LA Times, and many others. He is the author of the book 5 Myths About Nuclear Weapons. His latest book, It Is Possible, A Future Without Nuclear Weapons, has been endorsed by world leaders, Nobel Peace Prize laureates, 4-star generals, physicists, religious leaders, United Nations officials, activists, and others. Noted activist Emma Pike says, quote, "If you only ever read one book about nuclear weapons, let it be this one. The book has an almost disarmingly straightforward answer for every conceivable challenge to the idea that a future free from nuclear weapons can exist. This guidebook for eliminating nuclear weapons will give even the most resolute cynic reason to hope that it is indeed possible." I should note that we do have copies of this book for sale in the lobby, and Mr. Wilson will be holding a book signing after his presentation. It is now my pleasure to welcome Ward Hayes Wilson to Southern Utah University and to the Eccles A.P.E.X. stage.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here on this beautiful campus. And I think I told you the wrong name. I think it's the Grand Ballroom of the Geneva UN. I have a picture. I'll send it to you. Our hardest problem, of course, is nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons are an uncomfortable subject. Most people try not to think about them. Nuclear weapons are dangerous and scary, and there's nothing you can do about them. They're a risk you have to live with and do your best to put them out of your mind. Or at least that's what most people think. But there are 3 mysteries that I want you to think about, mysteries that paradoxically are the key to unlocking how to eliminate nuclear weapons. Imagine you had a neighbor who was excited about a weed whacker. he thought it was the best weed whacker in the world. You'd run into him in the neighborhood and he'd start talking your ear off about how great his weed whacker was. And then he used it one weekend. You could all hear it, and he was all excited. And then he took it and put it in the shed and left it there for 79 years. That's what the United States has done. We used nuclear weapons twice in a single week in August 1945. Then we put them in the shed, and we've never used them since, for more than 3/4 of a century. So the first mystery is, what kind of ultimate tool gets used once and never used again? Aren't the best tools the ones that you use all the time? Second mystery is 1991, President George H.W. Bush, a cautious establishment man, not a left-leaning liberal, unilaterally retired all but a handful of U.S. battlefield nuclear weapons, the short-range ones. And they were the ones that for 30 years we were planning to use in Europe to prevent the Soviet Union from storming across Europe and conquering it. But he retired them all. He didn't get a treaty. He just got rid of them, as if it was perfectly fine for the United States to scrap an entire class of nuclear weapons, even if no one else did the same. And the military supported him. So what's up with that? Why wasn't he impeached? Third, we all know that nuclear weapons guarantee our safety. We say it to each other all the time, but here's the thing. The International Red Cross did a survey of millennials in the US in 2019, and they asked them if they thought a nuclear weapon would be used anywhere in the world in the next 10 years, and 58.5% said yes. Then they asked if they thought there would be a war like World War II in their lifetime, and again, about the same percentage said yes. So we say we rely on nuclear deterrence, we say we trust it, we think it's safe, but apparently, in private, a lot of people in their hearts harbor doubts about whether nuclear deterrence is going to work. If nuclear weapons guarantee our safety, why do millions of Americans secretly think there's going to be a nuclear war? 79 years of non-use, unilaterally scrapping thousands of weapons, and contradictory beliefs about whether the nuclear weapons keep us safe. These are the mysteries that hold the key, and we'll come back to them. Just some facts. Nuclear weapons are powerful explosives. One nuclear weapon could devastate a city. There are about 12,000 nuclear weapons in the world, possessed by 9 countries, the Russians and the US. Our arsenals make up about 90% of the total of all the weapons. And even though in the 1980s, and the 1990s, and the 2000s, there were a series of treaties that reduced the size of the arsenals, now that trend has reversed. All the nuclear-armed states are currently upgrading their weapons, expanding their arsenals, or both. Many non-nuclear countries like Germany, South Korea, Japan, Iran, and others are thinking seriously about acquiring nuclear weapons. We're in the midst of a second nuclear arms race. Along with those increasing numbers, there have also been threats and increasing talk about actually using nuclear weapons. Given the wars and the confrontations now going on in Ukraine and the Middle East and the Congo and the face-off over Taiwan and tensions in Korea, a large-scale war between great powers seems like a real possibility. And any large-scale war would almost certainly escalate to nuclear war. Secretary General of the United States, Antonio Guterres, says, "The danger of nuclear war is now as great as it's ever been. Nuclear war would probably devastate the northern hemisphere, probably kill between 100 million and 200 million people, and it would set civilization back several centuries. The southern hemisphere would be largely untouched." These are the facts, and they're concerning. There's a real risk of nuclear war. Fortunately, we here in the United States are uniquely positioned to find a way to avoid nuclear war. As Americans, we are heirs to an enduring tradition of optimism and confidence. We have a history of overcoming seemingly impossible odds. At the very beginning, when our country was small and weak, we beat the greatest power, military power on the face of the earth, the United Kingdom, or Great Britain then. Since then, we conquered the wilderness, became an industrial powerhouse, built skyscrapers and highways, created prosperity, developed cures and vaccines. We went to the moon. Throughout our history, we have been propelled by a belief that we could handle any challenge. When the Great Depression hit in the 30s, we didn't despair. We didn't hang our heads and numbly wait for it to pass. We decided to build our way out of it. And the signature project of that effort was the Grand Coulee Dam, at the time the biggest dam in the world. Even when times were tough, we dreamed big. When World War II broke out, we were faced with a perilous situation. We had to fight two dangerous and powerful adversaries on either side of the globe at the same time. But we didn't worry. We didn't hesitate. We never had any doubt we would win. Look at the faces of these young men going off to war. They're smiling. Those smiles say, "Don't worry, Mom, we got this." And then we went to the moon, not because we had to, but because we just loved the challenge of doing something that seemed impossible and no one else had ever done. Even though some people say there's nothing that can be done about nuclear weapons, at least one of our presidents argued that we absolutely can solve this problem. In a famous speech, President John F. Kennedy said, "Too many of us think peace is impossible. Too many think it's unreal. But that's a dangerous, defeatist belief. It leads to the conclusion that war is inevitable, that mankind is doomed, that we're gripped by forces we cannot control. We need not accept that view. Our problems are man-made, therefore they can be solved by man. No problem of human destiny is beyond human beings." He at least believed we could solve the nuclear weapons problem. Last year I took a stab at rethinking nuclear weapons, questioning all the assumptions and reimagining the entire approach. And I laid these ideas out in a book called "It is Possible, A Future Without Nuclear Weapons." And then I sent it to some leaders and experts and asked them to have a look. I sent a copy to Lee Butler, a retired four-star Air Force general, a former commander of STRATCOM, the command that controls all our nuclear weapons. And he's a guy who's been in the room with the big board. He knows this stuff backwards and forwards. He read the book and called this new realist approach the most intelligent, comprehensive, and compelling argument ever advanced against nuclear weapons. Richard Rhodes, a Pulitzer Prize-winning historian who wrote the big 4-volume definitive history of nuclear weapons, said, "In this stunning breakthrough work, Ward Hayes Wilson brilliantly dismantles the false claims that have kept a nuclear sword of Damocles dangling over our heads for so long." J. Ramos Horta, who's the current president of the country of Timor-Leste and also a Nobel Peace Prize winner, said that it's a book that should be read by every decision maker and everyone else across the globe. And Oscar Arias, a former president of Costa Rica and a Nobel Prize winner, was so impressed he made a video endorsing the book, and in that he said, "Ward Wilson's new book makes me believe that the elimination of nuclear weapons is possible in our lifetime." And Don Oscar is 85 years old, so tick-tock, tick-tock. These endorsements are humbling. And there are more Ryan was talking about. But these people who looked at this book take it very seriously. You should too. Let's start with how we got here. The story begins with a famous birth, the birth of a set of beliefs. It's a high, windy plateau in the American Southwest, the rumble of distant thunder, the night sky suddenly lit by flashes of lightning. There's tension and waiting, and then the incredible explosion. And one observer called it a great blinding light, as if God himself had appeared among us. Then an explosion like a vision from the book of Revelation. Someone else described the awesome roar which warned of doomsday and made us feel we were blasphemous to dare tamper with the forces hitherto reserved to the Almighty. J. Robert Oppenheimer, the scientist most responsible for building the atomic bomb, said he thought in that moment of a quote from the sacred Hindu text, the Bhagavad Gita, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." And Oppenheimer was telling the truth. Not the literal truth, not the factual truth, not even the realistic truth. What he captured exactly was the truth of how he felt and how the others felt. They felt they had discovered godlike power. They had somehow stumbled on the hammer of God, a hammer they could use to smite their enemies. Suddenly they were no longer geeky physicists. Now somehow they had become Shiva, the Hindu god of destruction, Ares, the remorseless Greek god of war, Tyr, the terrible one-handed Norse god of implacable victory. And the beliefs that would spread a dark shadow over all humankind were born. And then Hiroshima was bombed, and Nagasaki was bombed, and the Japanese surrendered in just 4 days. It was the proof, the absolute confirmation, as if any were needed, that the bombs really did confer godlike power on their possessors. And the set of beliefs that began in the moment when the bomb went off grew and spread. The weapons were obviously decisive in war. Hiroshima showed that. Because of their enormous size, they were clearly the ultimate weapon. They were such powerful weapons, they certainly guaranteed the safety of any nation that possessed them. And without question, every unscrupulous, aggressive, bloodthirsty leader would stop at nothing to get them. Even if you could ban them, someone would always rebuild them, so they would always exist. We have lived with these beliefs for almost 80 years. They've shaped our thinking and served as the foundation of our policies. They are so familiar, so completely woven into the fabric of our lives, that they seem axiomatic, unquestionable. But how can we be sure these beliefs are true? We only use nuclear weapons those 2 times. We don't have a big base of evidence. What if they're not facts? What if those beliefs are somehow myths? There's a lot of talk of God and, ancient warriors. One of the key characteristics of myths is that they masquerade as facts. Britannica says, every myth presents itself as an authoritative, factual account, no matter how the narrated events are at variance with natural law or ordinary experience. Is it possible that even though we've accepted these beliefs as facts for decades, that they might somehow be wrong? Let's re-examine these 4 claims carefully with an objective eye and try to figure out, are they facts? Are they fiction? Let's start with Hiroshima. The proof was false. What forced Japan to surrender was the entry of the Soviet Union, which up to then had been neutral, into the war. Among many reasons to think that it was the entry of the Soviets that forced surrender, let me just mention 3. First, we know Japan surrendered because of the Soviet declaration of war because that's what they said they would do. at a meeting of the ruling body, the Supreme Council, in June of 1945, and they discussed that the neutrality pact with the Soviet Union might be coming to an end, and they said, if the Soviets come into the war, we have to surrender. General Kwabe Torashiro said, the absolute maintenance of peace in our relations with the Soviet Union is imperative for the continuation of the war. They couldn't go on if the Soviets came in. Then 2 months later, at midnight on the night of August 8th, 9th, the Soviets declared war. Japan's leaders held a series of frantic meetings. By 10:30 the next morning, the Supreme Council had been rushed into emergency session to discuss surrender for the first time in 14 years of war. They were deadlocked. The talks went on into the night. At about 2 a.m. the next morning, after 15 hours of contentious debate, Japan's leaders tearfully agreed that they would have to surrender. So they said they'd surrender if the Soviets came in. The Soviets came in, and within 26 hours, they said they were going to surrender. So what could be clearer than that? The second reason to doubt that it was the bombings is that Japan's leaders obviously didn't care about city bombing. Excuse me. In the summer of 1945, the United States carried out one of the most ferocious campaigns of city bombing in the history of the world. We bombed 68 cities. We destroyed them. Many of them were more completely destroyed than Hiroshima. On average, we bombed one every other day throughout the summer. And yet, when Navy Chief of Staff Toyoda Soeme was asked about the bombing in his post-war interrogation, he said that the Supreme Council had never considered city bombing as a reason to surrender. Minister of War Anami Korechika dismissed the atomic bombing, saying they were no worse than the firebombing Japan had endured all summer long. And he wasn't exaggerating. If you graph the number of people immediately killed in all 68 of those attacks, Hiroshima is second. Tokyo, a conventional attack, killed more people. If you graph the number of square miles destroyed, Hiroshima is fourth. If you graph the percentage of the city destroyed, Hiroshima is 17th. Toyama, a city about the size of Chattanooga, was 99% destroyed by conventional bombing. Japan's leaders didn't surrender because of these two cities that we bombed, because they didn't care about city bombing. Third, we know Japan's leaders didn't surrender because of the atomic bombings, because war is fundamentally a military contest. Military contests are decided by military outcomes. When Wyatt Earp and Doc Holliday shot it out at the OK Corral with the Clanton brothers, it wasn't the side that shot the most bystanders that won the gunfight. It was the side that shot the most gunslingers that won. Bombing civilians is effectively shooting bystanders. War is about defeating your adversary's military. If you claim that killing civilians can win wars, you have misunderstood how wars are won. So the proof that nuclear weapons represented godlike power that could force countries to surrender in just days was actually no proof at all. Nuclear weapons were not decisive in ending World War II. It is not realism to imagine that killing civilians can win wars. Nuclear weapons make the largest explosions of any weapons in the world, which means they're the ultimate weapon, the most useful weapon, right? Because the size determines how useful a weapon is. No, it doesn't. Consider, for example, this hammer. It's a large hammer, maybe the biggest hammer in the world, but you'd need two guys to lift it and maybe a third to hold the nail, and you're going to mash the hand of the guy who's holding the nail. You'll probably leave a dent in the wood, and you cannot use this hammer in a confined space. If you need to hammer something in the closet, forget about it. Size is not what determines how useful a tool is And weapons are tools of war. Consider the problems of size, the problems that size creates on the battlefield. On a typical battlefield, opposing troops are anywhere from 1/3 of a mile apart to a few yards apart. A 10-kiloton battlefield weapon, and the majority of Russian tactical battlefield weapons are 10 kilotons, which is about 2/3 the Hiroshima bomb. A 10-kiloton explosion creates a circle of severe effects about a mile in diameter, with more diminishing effects out to about 5 miles. So if you want to use a nuclear weapon against their frontline troops, you will kill some of your frontline troops. But size is not the only problem. Nuclear weapons release radiation, a poison that goes wherever the wind blows it. That same 10-kiloton explosion can spread lethal radiation up to 25 miles in an hour, and less harmful fallout hundreds or thousands of miles farther. Their size and the uncontrollable nature of radiation, it goes wherever the wind's blowing at that moment, make it almost impossible to find a practical, useful role for nuclear weapons on the battlefield. And the size problem explains a lot. Suddenly that question about why we haven't used nuclear weapons in 79 years starts to make a lot more sense. It's hard to find a sensible way to get military value from nuclear weapons. And it explains George W. Bush's decision to withdraw all those battlefield weapons from Europe. Apparently, after years of careful study and wargaming and strategizing, political leaders and military strategists became convinced that battlefield weapons had so little utility they could safely be scrapped whether anyone else scrapped theirs or not. That same conclusion can be applied to strategic weapons, the ones you use for long-range attacks on your adversary's homeland. As countless war games and studies have confirmed, fighting a war with nuclear weapons is simply suicidal. That's what led President Reagan to declare that a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. The reason is simple. If you fight a war with nuclear weapons, after the war ends, your country will be crippled, starving, poisoned, and no longer in control of its own destiny. It's hard to argue that fighting a long-range war with nuclear weapons would be anything other than folly. There's no question that nuclear weapons make the biggest explosions, but it turns out that doesn't make them the ultimate weapon. Actually, the whole trend in warfare over the last 50 years has been away from big blundering weapons and towards smarter, smaller, more accurate, more discriminate weapons. In the history of the evolution of war, nuclear weapons look like dinosaurs, too big to survive. Nuclear weapons are simply too big and spread too much poison to be practical weapons of war. Militarily, they are effectively useless. They are not the ultimate weapon. It is not realism to confuse size with effectiveness. Of course, nuclear weapons advocates say that no one really wants to use them in war. The real value is as deterrent. Deterrence, nuclear deterrence is where you threaten to counterattack with nuclear weapons if people do things you don't like, attack you, or so on. Most people assume that the experts are right, that nuclear deterrence works really well, because we haven't had a nuclear war in more than almost 80 years. Actually, nuclear deterrence has failed a number of times. In 1948, even though the US had a monopoly on nuclear weapons, Joseph Stalin wasn't deterred from blockading Berlin in a dangerous standoff that lasted almost a year and could have easily touched off a war. During the Korean War, even though the US moved nuclear-capable bombers to Guam and then leaked word of the move, the Chinese still sent hundreds of thousands of soldiers into the war. In 1973, everyone knew the Israelis had nuclear weapons. It had been reported in the New York Times. But that didn't stop Egypt and Syria from making war on Israeli forces in the occupied territories. In 1982, the Argentines attacked the Falkland Islands, even though the United Kingdom had nuclear weapons and the Argentines did not. And in the run-up to the Gulf War, the U.S. solemnly warned Saddam Hussein that it would use the strongest possible response. We know what they're talking about. If Saddam launched chemical weapons against U.S. forces, set Kuwaiti oil wells on fire, or attacked our allies and friends in the region, Israel. But as we know, the Iraqis set more than 600 oil wells on fire and continually fired Scud missiles at Israeli civilians. But the most frightening deterrence failure came during the Cuban Missile Crisis. President Kennedy knew that if he blockaded Cuba with so many troops so close to each other with so much tension, any mistake could spiral into global nuclear war. Kennedy was Harvard educated. He was a smart guy. Even so, he went ahead with the blockade. He wasn't deterred by the risk of nuclear war. And there were times when we came within a hair's breadth of things getting out of control. Perhaps the most serious came Saturday, October 27, 1962. At the height of the crisis, both sides are on hair trigger alert. The guidance system on a U-2 spy plane taking some air samples over the North Pole malfunctioned. And the plane eventually strayed off course 300 miles inside the Soviet Union. Soviets saw it on radar and they immediately scrambled MiGs to shoot it down. We scrambled F-102s to find it and protect it. But because it was the biggest crisis in the history of the U.S., U.S. forces were at DEFCON 2, one step below nuclear war. Air Force procedures at that time dictated that at DEFCON 2, all the fighters in the Alaska Command had their regular missiles, their regular air-to-air missiles removed and replaced with nuclear missiles. So the only weapons those fighters had as they roared towards Soviet airspace and potentially a shootout with Russian MiGs were nuclear weapons. Those two groups of fighters had found each other and fought it out. There would have been a nuclear explosion over the Soviet Union and almost certainly a nuclear war. They didn't find each other. But it wasn't the magic of deterrence that prevented war. Years later, when Robert McNamara, Kennedy's defense secretary, was asked, "How did we survive the Cuban Missile Crisis?" he said, "It was luck." And he's right. That's a sobering thought. Nuclear deterrence failed during the Cuban Missile Crisis. But on that day, like the other days when nuclear deterrence failed, we were lucky. The fate of civilization, your fate, my fate, was decided by chance. The problem with nuclear deterrence is that it is no more than wishful thinking. We want it to work so much. And to be fair, it does work some of the time, maybe even most of the time. But in the long run, it is bound to fail. The reason's obvious. By its very nature, nuclear deterrence has to be perfect. Even a single failure could lead to a catastrophic war, hundreds of millions of people killed. This requirement of perfection creates a problem because of us, our human nature. All human beings are fallible. We all make mistakes. No one's perfect, from the lowest soldier to the highest leader. And human beings are intimately involved in nuclear deterrence. Nuclear deterrence is not some machine that runs by itself in a corner. We make the threats. Other human beings evaluate the threats and decide how to respond. It's a back and forth process governed by human beings. So if human beings are prone to folly and we are. And if human beings are involved with nuclear deterrence, and we manage every step, then nuclear deterrence is, by definition, inherently flawed. It will fail. It cannot run perfectly forever. Eventually, our luck will run out, and one of those failures will end in catastrophe. It's not a question of if. It's just a matter of when. It is not realism to rely for your security on a strategy that will inevitably end in catastrophe. Nuclear deterrence does not guarantee our safety over the long run, and we should have known that from the beginning. Because as any genuine realist will tell you, there are no guarantees in life. So there it is. The beliefs that serve as the foundation of our nuclear weapons policy present themselves as fact, but are nothing more than a collection of myths. In that first moment of awe and fear, Oppenheimer got it exactly wrong. Despite the mythology that has been wrapped around them like a shroud, the truth is that nuclear weapons are largely useless militarily. They do not in any way give us the power of gods. And if these first three, decisive in war, ultimate weapon, guarantee safety, are myths, then the belief that there's no way to get rid of them is also a myth. So we've walked now through the valley of the shadow of death, and we've emerged into the light. We can see now that JFK was right. We can eliminate nuclear weapons. What's been holding us back is a series of myths. So if we can strip away the myths around them, we ought to be able to eliminate nuclear weapons and the danger of nuclear war, which is good news. But it's also kind of confusing because it's hard to take in. We've lived so long with these ideas. We've lived so long in the thrall of these myths, it's difficult to imagine a world without them, much less how to get there. So how do we do it? What would be useful would be if we had a model of how to get from where we are to where we want to go. It would be great if we could find a treaty that shows us how a deadly, frightful weapon could be successfully banned. I mean, that would be really helpful in trying to figure out how to do this with nuclear weapons. As it turns out, there is such a treaty. The Biological Weapons Convention banned biological weapons worldwide, has been in force for more than 40 years, and no serious breaches of the treaty have occurred. It is a treaty that works. And unlike nuclear weapons disarmament negotiations, which take years and end up with even just the smallest progress, the negotiations to completely ban biological weapons worldwide took almost no time at all. Does anyone know how long it took to negotiate this treaty? Anybody? 2 years. So how could we get nuclear weapons treaty negotiations to be as swift and successful as the biological weapons negotiations were? What's the key? The Biological Weapons Convention didn't call for one country to lay down their weapons and then hope that that would inspire others to lay theirs down too. It insisted that everyone lay down their weapons simultaneously, which they did. So how'd they do it? What was the secret? They were able to do it because they had a crucial advantage. They had something nuclear weapons negotiations have never had. What they had was a convincing and widely held consensus that biological weapons were lousy weapons. It was obvious that biological weapons could kill a lot of people. But it was also obvious that they were weapons that lacked any real military utility. The COVID pandemic illustrates why. If a virus can jump from a wet market or a lab or whatever to one guy in China, and 3 years later you have 11 million people dead around the world, imagine what a disaster it would be to fight a war with weapons that blast millions of pathogens into the air, sea, and soil. You use biological weapons, the diseases they let loose will inevitably come back to harm your soldiers, your economy, your country. It doesn't take a genius to see that as weapons, they're militarily useless. So because there was this consensus, everyone said, yeah, these weapons, I don't know. The negotiations to ban biological weapons were smooth and swift. So the key to eliminating nuclear weapons is to make a case, a rational, realist case, that nuclear weapons are just like biological weapons, that they lack military utility, and that they're dangerous and difficult to control. And that's just what we've done here today. As we've seen, nuclear weapons are too big and uncontrollable to use in the battlefield. They're suicidal for long-range wars, and although deterrence can work, it's going to be fatal over the long run. The crucial step to negotiating a successful treaty is to strip away the myths that surround nuclear weapons. If we insist on looking at nuclear weapons realistically, the path is open to eliminating them and the danger of nuclear war that they pose. So how do we replace the existing consensus that nuclear weapons are the ultimate weapon with a worldwide consensus that they are lousy weapons? Well, turning for help to the small group of experts in Washington who make nuclear weapons policy isn't going to work. If ordinary folks like you and me find it hard to imagine a way out of this situation, think how hard it would be if you had been fully committed to these myths for your entire life, and your sense of self-worth, and you depended on them being true. The experts are going to be a roadblock, not allies. We're going to have to do this ourselves, which means some kind of grassroots campaign. But we know how to do that. You start at the local level, work up to the state level, and then go national. I'm from the Chicago area, so this is how I imagine such a campaign would look. You'd start with a few towns, get them to pass local resolutions saying nuclear weapons are dangerous and virtually useless. Once several towns have passed the resolution, you go work on getting a major city spread out to other towns. You continue to expand first to the state level, then to the national level, and pretty soon, once we've built that grassroots support, we go to Congress and get them to pass a resolution that has three parts. First, it declares that our goal is a treaty where all 9 nuclear-armed states get rid of their nuclear weapons simultaneously. Second, it insists that the United States won't lay down a single weapon until everyone agrees to the treaty. And third, it calls on the United States to take the lead in this worldwide movement to convince the other 8 nuclear-armed countries that nuclear weapons are virtually useless militarily. It's possible. Nuclear weapons are not forever weapons. So what does that mean? It means you are called to do something about this danger we all face. I am calling you. Perhaps you have a higher authority that's also calling you. If you can protect the weak and the very young, if there's a way for you to keep innocent people out of harm's way, I think you have an obligation to do it. Knowing the truth is power, but along with power comes responsibility. What can you do to meet that responsibility? First, have faith. Have faith. Faith is strength. Come together in groups and imagine a future, believe in a future without nuclear weapons, because it's possible. Second, speak. We've been silent for too long. Rise up and speak. Break the taboo on talking about nuclear weapons and tell our political leaders that they have been seduced by a false god and that nuclear weapons do not give us godlike power. The organization I created has a petition that calls for a new consensus along the lines we talked about. I dream of getting 1 million signatures on that petition. Political power is built out of people who take a stand. I think we're going to have the petition out here on the book table. Please sign it. Third, embrace reality. For decades, we've been told with a certain condescension that we are foolish idealists and our harebrained schemes will get us all killed. Nothing could be farther from the truth. We are the realists. We are the ones who see the facts unclouded by wishful thinking. We have not been seduced. Now that you've seen the reality, you're called to proclaim it. Finally, I would ask you to join Realist Revolt. There's a power in numbers. It's free. The newsletter will tell you more about this issue. It's a community where you can strengthen each other and we can trade ideas about what works and begin to make this happen. We live in a magnificent, bountiful world. I've traveled to many lands, made many friends, and have seen with my own eyes that the great worldwide civilization that has been handed down to us, that we and all our forebearers have built together, is rich with breathtaking works of art, vibrant traditions, magnificent structures, ancient faiths, vast repositories of knowledge, great halls where we can gather together and share our common humanity. Look down on the civilization that we have made. We, together, have constructed a thing of beauty that shines with 1 million points of light. Imagine for a moment that that world could be safe. Imagine a future without nuclear weapons. It will not be a world without risk. It will not be a world without war. It will not be a perfect world. But it will be a world where we won't be haunted in some corner of our brains by a fear that maybe today, maybe tomorrow, maybe next week, but someday, all that we have and all that we've built will suddenly be turned to smoke and ashes. What a weight it would be to lift that off our shoulders if we could banish that dark sense of foreboding. A world without nuclear weapons will be a world where children can dream of being an astronaut or an inventor or something amazing, and no little voice will ever whisper to them, "Your future may never come." A world without nuclear weapons will be a world of widening possibilities, a world of bold and sweeping plans that confidently look to remake the future for the better. Eliminating nuclear weapons isn't a cure-all, but it will give us a shot of confidence, of energy, a steady current of determination. Perhaps it'll even bring back that kind of brash optimism that actually welcomes adversity, because overcoming great difficulties calls forth what is best in all of us. Eliminating nuclear weapons will give us the confidence to throw our weight into larger, more complex challenges like reversing climate change. In other words, it will go a long way towards restoring that strong American optimism that carried us onward and upward for so long. Change is coming. We're on the cusp of a different future. I believe we can make it a better future. History rarely affords people like us, ordinary people, the chance to make change for the better that will benefit people around the world. Such weighty matters are rarely put in the hands of teachers, state employees, or union members, or college students, or small business owners, or rabbis, or ministers, or imams. But in this country, in this hour, that is our privilege. Our leaders have been blinded to the reality, and therefore we bear the responsibility for a safer future. So let us turn our eyes toward the dawn. The ocean is vast and deep. The storms now raging on it might well wash us down. But the time for fear is past. There are no guarantees, and we should have set out long ago. But it's not too late to seek a newer world. With courage as our watchword, with reality as our guide, and with faith our constant companion, there is no landfall that is beyond our reach. Thank you.